and I'm here to share another in our strategic planning series from Framework Consulting. Should you be realistic or visionary in your strategic planning retreat? And thanks for joining me again. And let's see, let's flip over to the live video, and I'll explain the problem just a little bit. Yes, so this is a challenge that many of our clients share with us. It has to do with whether or not you focus on the future or the present as you create a strategic plan. And there's always a tug, sort of a tussle between those who are more visionary and those who are more realistic. Sometimes it even comes down to age. Younger ones are more visionary, older ones are a bit more conservative and a bit more realistic, maybe from past unfortunate experience. So as we get into it, I want to share some of the ideas that we have in this area and why they're making a difference with our clients. So let me flip over to the presentation. So should you be realistic or visionary in your strategic planning retreat? So really, the problem is not the visionary or the realistic aspects. The real question is producing plans which are not and cannot be implemented. So it's the problem when you fail to answer the question is that you waste the time spent in the retreat and you end up with a product which is unimplementable for different reasons. And as a sponsor or someone who is trying to make sure the strategic planning retreat goes well, you may be left with a confusing question. So who do you side with? Is it the realists, or do you stick with the visionaries and the energy that they bring? How do you balance the two points of view? And probably know that you need to resolve this question. If you don't, people, when you go to tell them that there's another strategic planning retreat coming up, they roll their eyes because they remember that last year's produced a plan which wasn't implemented. And as a result, you may get them rolling their eyes, and as they become jaded to the whole activity, come to believe from past experience that nothing makes a difference, and it always results in a poor outcome. And then what they learn to do over time is as you start to build the momentum towards the retreat, they learn to just completely ignore it and treat it as if it's not important at all. Which is really, really unfortunate, because strategic planning retreat is an awesome opportunity to make a very big difference in the way your company does its business. Eventually, there'll even be an impact on your reputation. So what do I mean by that? Well, over time, people come to relate to you as if, oh yeah, you're a strategic planning guy. Yeah, we're doing it again this year, right? Yeah, okay, well, whatever. And having failed retreats becomes a part of how people actually see you, which, as you can imagine, would be terribly, terribly unfortunate. But in the end, the big loser is the company. There's many companies in the Caribbean that failed to develop a proper strategy, and as a result, suffered. One of the major examples, of course, is Cable and Wireless in Jamaica. When the mobile telephone market liberalized, they completely underestimated the impact that new entrants would have. Went from having 100% market share to whatever it is they have today, which is debatable, but it's somewhere around, people say 30, 40, 50%. But it was a tremendous loss to the company. And they had ample time to prepare for it, but they had no strategy in place, the wrong strategy in place to deal with the problem. If you're interested, you can contact me. I interviewed the fellow who led the mobile unit at the time, and it's a cautionary tale of how he tried to get the attention of his senior management in the right way, wasn't able to. The company never developed the right strategy, and the result was catastrophic. So what do some people do when they realize that there's this tension between the two groups? Well, some sponsors just capitulate and they say, you know what, get the CEO to make the decision. Whatever he does, he can decide. In other words, they pass the buck and avoid responsibility. They don't see it as something that they need to design into the retreat. They see it as just some decision that somebody else needs to make, and he'll take the fall for it in case it's not done well. Or she. Or sometimes the sponsor may say, why don't we just vote on it? You know, they get fed up and tired and decide that putting up hands is the best way to decide a complex issue. That is a huge mistake. If your strategic plan retreat comes down to voting, you are implementing a major problem, because the losers will always realize that they're the losers, and you won't get their buy-in in the long term. Terrible mistake. Ultimately, some companies just say, you know what, we're so bad at it, let's just forget about it. So they forget about having the retreat. They forget about putting together a strategic plan as a team. Instead, they give it to the strategic planning department to put together. And that is never, ever a good idea if they're the only ones who really do the hard work. It's never a good idea either for the chairman to do it or the president to do it. It deserves to be a group activity, an activity that's performed by a team. The good news is that if you solve this problem, you can bring people's trust right back up to where it needs to be, even if they've had poor experiences in the past. So it's worth putting some time and effort into it. Visionaries or realists? How do you balance the two energies so that you end up with a plan that is implementable and implemented? So you need a solution to connect the visionaries with the realists, not to ignore the gap, not to paper over it, not to pretend it doesn't exist, but a strategy, a design for doing the retreat that brings them together onto the same page. So before I get into it, just to recap, I did a video on over the horizon planning that in the sequence came just before this one. It had to do with setting a target year in the future, defining a particular scenario, a chosen scenario from many, but finding one, and then detailing it first in words and then in numbers. So here's the result of that activity, which typically in our case comes on the second day of the retreat. So here's a particular scenario developed for the year 2030 for a generic company. This is a sort of a limited description of the scenario. Only has 4 lines, just for the sake of simplicity. Usually has a lot more. But this is what the company is intending to accomplish in the year 2030. And the team has already aligned or agreed that this is the outcome they're striving for. So what you know as a sponsor is that behind every single target, like the one I just presented, there is a reality. So in this particular case, the company has a reality of 2016 results. We're in 2017, so the last year they have 12 months of results is for 2016. So you can see that for the 4 metrics I shared before, in 2030, there is a reality lurking in the background, which is an actual factual accomplishment. And here you have a revenue number, profit margin number, headcount, market position. These reflect the current day numbers. So essentially, the company is trying to make a jump from $179 million in 2016 to a jump of $556 million in revenue in 2030. Great. So if you have a beginning and an end, all you need to do essentially in the middle is to find a way to fill the gap. That should be pretty easy, right? Well, not really. It looks easy. It looks like it's just a matter of putting in an equation and filling in the math. Let me tell you let me share with you the reality of what needs to be done. So we use and recommend the Merlin process, which is a method for doing what's called backcasting. And here's how we implement it in a strategic planning retreat. The first is to form a small sub-team, which usually consists of the CEO, the CFO, and 2 or 3 other members of the entire team. So it's a small sub-team. They need to work on the task alone. So this is not an activity for the entire team. It has way too much detail. It's far too intense. The trade-offs are too hard to make for a big team to do it as an entire team. As a result, we usually have them do it on their own on the night of the first day of the retreat. And what we teach them before they start is that they need to work in the future, start with the future, and actually work back in time. Hence the word forecasting, because you're starting with a target and you're attempting to connect the target with today's results. So the way you do that is you start with 2030 and as a team work back to 2016. So here's what a initial chart may look like. So it starts to look as if the numbers in the future are connected to the numbers today. So this activity isn't, as I said before, it's not just, however, about filling in numbers, because there's a reason these numbers are changing, and they're not changing as a result of business as usual. They're changing as a result of, well, let's see, projects, initiatives, interventions, decisions that are made to cause these numbers to move in the right directions, to make quantum jumps. So where do these projects come from? So the team usually doesn't just invent these numbers. They use the discussion that took place on the first day of the retreat to figure out what projects need to be put in place to cause these numbers to move in the way that they need to move in order to accomplish 2030. So during the overnight activity, as they follow the Merlin process, they're asking, what projects, and maybe this is the first question they ask, what projects do we need to insert during, in this case, the next 13, 14 years, so that these numbers move in the way that we want them to move? How do we get to 556 million? So for example, this company decided to acquire a competitor in 2020 or 2021, somewhere in there. And that's what caused a revenue jump from 375 million in 2020 to 556 million in 2030. So this is a small number of projects. Again, this is just for demonstration purposes. I've worked with companies that have put together 20 projects, for example. But these are the ones that the team, the sub-team, decides need to be put in place in order to move the numbers. So as you can imagine, this is a complex activity. And this is why a small team needs to put this chart together. Fortunately, this chart connects the visionary with the realist. Why? Because it shows a clear pathway, a feasible way to get from today to the future. It satisfies both sets of stakeholders. This chart, of course, does not have the projects in it, but it should. It connects the visionaries with those who insist that today's reality needs to be respected. The overall chart that's put together is one that's based on a realistic and coherent view of how we get from where we are today to the future. So that's not the end of it. Typically for us on the following morning, on the second day, the team presents the Merlin chart, the one I just showed you. They present the projects and they present the numbers as they move from the current to the future, or from the future back to the present, more accurate. The numbers as they're presented, of course, and the projects, this is not a final presentation by any means. This is presented as a draft. So you can imagine the in-depth and intricate conversation that takes place as the entire team dissects the work of the overnight team. So sometimes there are substantial changes as the team shares its logic. They get challenged frequently. The projects are dissected in detail sometimes, but the end result is a level of alignment. After they've had a tough conversation, asking all these questions, at the end of it, there is agreement, alignment, support for one single plan, a single multi-year plan, detailed, the likes of which many teams have never produced before. And in so doing, you don't leave behind either the visionary or the realist. You bring them right along for the ride. It's just that now you're confronting the limits of the present, the reality of the business, all of the factors that you had considered in the very first part of the retreat, the political, environmental, sociological, the pest of factors. You bring them all into the mix. You bring all of the projects together, that the brainstorming that's happened to develop the scenarios in the prior exercise, and this is the long-term future for the company as created by the team, fully aligned on and agreed to by all members. So if you're interested in learning more about the work that we do and this particular approach, I've written about it in a compilation that we've produced of articles I've written for regional newspapers. So the compilation has my very best articles. It's called Strategic Planning Problems in Caribbean Companies. And if you want to access it, you can use that particular download that we have just listed there. I'm going to mention it again in just a minute. But so this business of connecting the future to the present is one that we've worked with many companies on, and it's a pretty big challenge. Many of them struggle, frankly, with coming up with realistic plans, and often during this process, some very ambitious and well-meaning plans are discarded. I remember working with a company once that wanted to have its entire company be bilingual by a certain year in order to enter Central and South American markets. When they did the Merlin chart, they realized that there was no way they could do that. They had to absolutely change the plan in order to have it fit, because it takes a long time to produce a bilingual workforce. We can produce half of the members, of staff members, to be bilingual enough to answer the phone, for example, and do simple things. Another company, I remember, did the same process and realized that they would have to move their headquarters to Miami, Caribbean company, in order to service all of the customers they needed to service across the Latin American region. They didn't want to move they realized they didn't want to move their headquarters to Miami. It was a logical thing to do, but they didn't want to do it. When they realized they didn't want to do it, they decided to keep the headquarters in the country that they were in, not to move it, and to scale back their plans for entering Latin America. So when companies put together the Merlin chart, reality hits the vision. And the only way to mesh the two together into a single sort of progression of activity is to follow a process similar to the one I just shared. So if you want to learn some more, let me give you that URL again to download our report, the compilation of articles that I've written on this topic. It's I'm going to go to the screen, https://goo.gl/w lowercase w, the number 7, lowercase z, lowercase a, capital Q, and the number 7. So this is Francis Wade signing out from Framework Consulting on another in our series of strategic planning advice from retreats that we've led across the region. I'd love to hear how you implement the ideas that we've shared, particularly in this particular webinar. Contact me directly if you want at http://replytofrancis.info, and let me know how it goes for you as you go to implement these ideas. If you want to ask me questions, of course, you can do that also. And I wish you all the best. Take care. Signing out again. Bye-bye.